Thank you, everyone. You may take your seats now. We're going to have a discussion that I think has been touched on in every single panel that we've discussed today, which is on the conversation of money. And our premise today is to find out how effectively we can monetize media, considering both the consumer's range of options and the maximum that they're willing to pay. And I have a great panel joining me here, including, but not limited to, Njoki Chege, who's already joining us from Teams in Nairobi. Thank you for joining us, Njoki. She's a Director, Innovation Center at the Aga Khan University in Nairobi. I'm also joined by Mr. Gerrit Rabenstein, who is the head of DAC News Partnerships at Google in Germany. Thank you. Welcome. Please give him a round of applause. Anyway. And finally, we also have Owen Ripley, who is an Associate Assistant Deputy Minister, Cultural Affairs, Canadian Heritage. Okay, I'd like to sit here so that I can see Njoki. So before we begin, I want to find out from the audience. I'll ask a series of questions, and if it applies to you, please retain your hand up. How many people are currently paying for some form of news subscription? At least one. Okay, how many are paying for two? 3? 4? More than 4? How many of you are paying for some form of entertainment service? Wow. Okay. So I asked that to try and see where value is placed when it comes to entertainment and news. And Njoki, I'm not sure if you were able to see, but the majority of people are subscribed to some form of entertainment service and fewer for news. So are people valuing news? I think that's the first question I want to ask. Gerrit, let's start with you. You're thinking very hard about this. Yes, I'm asking you.
So thank you. First of all, thanks for the invitation. Thank you also for bringing this quite niche topic actually to this grand forum here. I thought we would be down there in the basement in a workshop setting, so I'm kind of surprised. So now I forgot your question. Value of content?
If you think that people still value media in the way that they might have before in the days of cable news.
Yeah. I think you're hitting the nail on the head. We are still, surprisingly, after 25 years of commercial internet, in this awkward transition phase that apparently content delivered via cable and pay TV or newspaper magazines in your mailbox are somehow valued differently than good journalism delivered online. And even though in the last years the trends have all gone to the right direction, so the Reuters digital news report shows that people are more willing to pay for news, at the same time it's still not as usual, as normal as it was 25 years ago.
All right, Njoki, I'd like to ask you the same question. If in the market of East Africa, or maybe the wider African region, if there's a clear understanding of what value media provides to society?
Thank you, Edith. And first of all, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's nice to see you, although on a digital platform. Yes, we are seeing a positive uptick of news in East Africa, particularly with the onset of COVID-19. Just like the global trends showed us that people valued news more because they were interested in understanding COVID-19, its impact and all that. So around 2020, 2021, there was a high uptick of subscriptions, and a lot of news media organizations locally registered an increase in website traffic. But the thing is, as is with every new product, every new subscription, we experienced a downfall of sorts, or maybe a churn rate, if you like, where people stopped their subscriptions after sort of COVID was declared to be not a pandemic anymore. So we've seen the rise, and now sort of it's on a downward curve. But generally, people do understand the value of news, and people do understand that it's important to support journalism. The news media organizations have tried their best to pass the message along of supporting high quality journalism, and there's been a positive uptake. Thank you.
All right, so Owen, of course, we're discussing here subscription models, but not every newsrooms operate this way. And the research that you quoted from the Reuters Institute also goes on to say that the proportion of people who are paying for news in the UK is as low as 11% and only 9% here in Germany. And it's believed to be because of the availability of public service media. I'm curious to know what the situation in Canada is.
So thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. The thing that struck me is, if there should be a room where every hand was up on subscribing to a news service, it probably should have been this one. So it's indicative, right, of, I think, the challenge that we face as a society in getting citizens to understand that producing journalism, producing news costs. And it's not that it was ever produced for free, right? The issue is, Canada, like many other countries, is undergoing a tremendous period of disruption in terms of the business model. So whereas in the past, a newspaper or broadcast was a very effective way of getting advertisement or classified ads in front of eyeballs, that's obviously being hugely disrupted by the emergence of platform economies. And so, as those revenues have shifted, the question then becomes for societies like Canada, well, how are we going to ensure that there's a minimum viable kind of journalism footprint? I approach it, I work for the Ministry of Culture in Canada, so from my perspective, public broadcasters are a critical part of the equation. CBC Radio Canada is a trusted source of information, but I do think we have to also think about how you ensure that there are private, news businesses that can, afford to invest in a journalism footprint and put forward different kinds of products and offerings for citizens.
All right, Njoki, I come back to you because Owen did mention something interesting here, the awareness among consumers about their role in financing content, but also those who choose to stick to public service media such as Deutsche Welle, but obviously not every country will have a strong publicly funded outlet. What happens to them?
Yeah, so, and this is a conversation that we need to have, especially in East Africa. We need to strengthen our public media systems and fund them to produce high quality journalism, because what is happening is that increasingly the high quality content is now under a paywall, and the fake news and all that trash is for free. So it means that the truth is behind the paywall, and then the lies are free. Because now that is where we are headed. If you do not have a subscription, you cannot access high quality news, let's say, for example, in one of the newspapers. So that's a conversation that we need to have. We've seen, particularly in the case of Kenya, with the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation, there's been some investment pumped in. They've tried to revive the station, bring in new journalists and all that, and they are seeing the value of journalism as a public good, because that's the conversation that we need to be having. But it's very worrying that it's increasingly, we are having an information divide in the country and in the region between the haves and the have-nots, with the haves being able to pay for subscriptions, having access to high quality news, and then the have-nots being left to read the free news that sometimes is not of very good quality. This is not to say that there's not good quality news that's available for free. There is, but it's very limited. If you compare it to what's behind the paywalls, you can see there's a big difference, and what we need to do is to close that knowledge gap.
Okay, we're going to get to this information inequality as I've heard it described before, but Gerrit, I want to come back to you because Njoki has introduced the idea of trash being free, trash being what's available online. And the argument, of course, is that as more content is being distributed through social platforms, that technology companies such as Google should be responsible for guaranteeing the integrity of information, or at the very least, support quality providers. What's your take on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are doing a lot, obviously, as a search engine. We are not a social network. We are a search engine, so we have the key interest to surface reliable information that the user is looking for in that moment. And obviously, we take many signals into consideration, the authority of the content source, so obviously region, language, etc. We run various experiments all the time on our platform to see how different content ranks and what people click on. And if we see, oh, content number 4 is more often clicked than content number 1, then that will have probably a consequence next.
Can you give us a general indication of what people are more likely to click on?
No, I can't.
Okay.
It's totally dependent on what you search for. You know, we have to acknowledge that only 2% of the searches have something to do with journalism. 98% have something to do with the rest of our lives that we live, searching for train connections to Bonn, information about East Africa, I don't know what is this building like. And that's why news plays a critical role for a search engine, but obviously we also do other things.
Right. Njoki, I wanted to come back to the point that you made, and I'm now quoting a white paper by the World Economic Forum, which was looking at the value of media, indicating that when looking at socioeconomic status, the report found that a greater proportion of paid news subscriptions were among higher income or higher status individuals, suggesting that an emerging information inequality is happening where wealthier consumers will have access to more high-quality information. Owen, can I get your reaction to this?
Oh, sorry. You changed the recipient of the question.
Yes, I'm sorry.
So I do think, you know, as a society, I come back to we need to make sure that citizens have access to information. This is, I mean, I'm not saying anything new that you haven't heard today, but this is fundamental to equipping folks to make decisions about who they vote for, about their health, right? And so if citizens cannot get access to that information, we have a major problem. And so I think it's, you know, I come back to it's got to be a mix of things. So I do believe that, you know, public broadcasters can play a really important role in providing access to information. I think that we need to support a diversity of different business models, and you know, that's the big question I think that's in flux right now, because at least in the Canadian context, there was kind of this standard model that worked. And I think what you're seeing now is folks experimenting with paywalls or putting up paywalls, which does provide, you know, an access barrier. It produces an access barrier for folks who may not be able to afford that subscription service. At the same time, you are seeing the emergence of even smart paywalls, though, who, you know, will recognize if you're someone who is unlikely to ever pay, at a certain point it starts to kind of grant you access. You're seeing the emergence of more community-based models, right? So going to the community and saying, you know, we care about the issues that this community cares about. Let's put together a model whereby, you know, we're really providing the news and information that community is asking for, with a view then to soliciting support from them, right? And so I think, you know, we need a variety of different things in each society, in each country, because that's going to be the way that you ensure that citizens at the end of the day can tap into, you know, accurate information one way or the other.
Okay, speaking of...
Can I build up on that?
Yeah, of course.
I couldn't agree more. There's there are so many options and things that news professionals, as we all here are in the room, can do. It's not only about the larger theme of things, but everyone who produces content, be it in Africa or in Europe, has various means at their hands to find a group that is interested, either through advertising or via subscriptions, in that content. And now more than ever, you have the chance to reach those audiences with whatever your content is. And I think if we talk about, I totally agree that we need to pay attention that every audience, that no audience segments gets not served.
Yeah.
But at the same time, this digital sphere that we are in allows with so hardly reduced costs to deliver news. I mean, 25 years ago, you needed a printing press, you needed a TV station, and today, you can create hyper-local news in every city that you live in for a newsletter, a Twitter feed, a website, etc. So I think there are lots of chances that you can still engage with your audience and also find people that are willing through advertising or subscriptions.
Actually, there is evidence to suggest that users are willing to pay more for personalized, in this case you said localized media, that has tailored content to help reduce the rate at which subscribers cancel their services. But Njoki, back to you. I'm thinking now of radio stations because somehow they seem to have survived. What can we learn from these models? Because obviously we can't personalize content for everyone, particularly for international media outlets.
That's a brilliant question, Edith, because in the case of East Africa, radio is one of the most vibrant news mediums. Particularly in Kenya, we have about, I think it's 173 radio stations, about 140 commercial radio stations, and maybe 41 or 42 community radio stations. Now, there's one thing that the so-called legacy news media organizations and, with all these paywalls can learn from the radio station, from the radio industry in Kenya, and that is the art of niche, the art of providing news and content to niche audiences, because there is a radio station for every Kenyan. I bet you, whether you're a middle-class Kenyan, whether you live in a slum or whatever language that you would like to be broadcasted on, there is something for everyone when it comes to radio, and that is the purpose of media. So radio has remained resilient, obviously because they've also been very innovative. When we think about innovation, many times we think about technology, apps, and all that. We forget that there's a lot of innovation that's going on in community media. Some of the topics that they're tackling are very niche topics and topics that speak directly to the community issues, issues that people resonate 100% with. We have some innovators that we work with, for example, who are providing news and information on HIV/AIDS through skits and plays to radio stations, through radio, and people are really showing up to get tested and all that. So as we think about innovation, as we think about business models and something to learn from, I think the radio industry in East Africa could offer one or two lessons even for the so-called legacy media.
Okay, Owen, I'm now thinking about the identity economy, as Njoki is talking about creating more and more niche content, referring, of course, to the expenditure on products and services that form part of consumers' self-expression. Do we risk creating even more echo chambers by doing this?
So I really get fascinated by this conversation because I think, what you are seeing is the emergence of communities, right, is the positive spin, and then you've had the research that has come out and showed the polarization in the social media space and the division of our societies into tribes, depending on kind of your political perspective, which would be the negative way to put it. And I think what's really critical for democracy is that communities are able to dialogue with each other about points over which they may disagree. Because if you can't achieve that, then again, we're in trouble. And media and journalism has always played a critical role in facilitating that dialogue. And I think, I forget who coined this term, but it's the idea of bridging voices, right? Who are the voices out there in society that can help communities or individuals who may very much disagree about certain things? Who can speak to both of those individuals or those communities and at least open up that dialogue? And so I think moving forward, we as societies and as the media sector really need to think about that idea of bridging voices and how you do that in what's increasingly a more and more polarized space.
Okay, and I'm now looking, sorry, I was just looking at some of the data that, again, was released from this report. I keep quoting it because it's fairly new. I think it was released this week, last week, which goes on to say that a quarter of the people who were interviewed believe that tech platforms should be responsible for paying for content, perhaps giving an indication of where recent narratives about the role of these companies in society may be headed. Gerrit, I want to speak to you about this. Do you think Google should be paying for news?
So Google is paying for certain type of news already now. You might know that we offer a special service or a special tool for newsrooms called Showcase, where we license showcase panels that show the most important, most up-to-date, etc. articles selected by newsrooms. So there's a curation service being done, and we pay for that. So that's something where we see a value add for both the platform, the publishers, or the news providers, and the audience. As long as we only surface news content in form of snippets, I think we deliver such a huge amount of traffic to news providers already, that some platforms get between 30 to 70% of their reach through Google. I think there is already a value transfer there.
Well, some news outlets will argue that 30 to 40% of their audience, 70% is taken away from their websites because they never leave Google.
No, those are the numbers where people click on a search result and land on the publisher's site.
Okay.
Can I jump in on this one? We got to make it a little spicy. So, so this debate's underway in many countries, in the world. And I think, for those who don't know, Government Canada actually recently tabled a new piece of legislation that is, at its core modeled or inspired from at least what's happened in Australia, and approaches the problem that, and the digital news report by the Reuters Institute shows that, digital platforms are a major vector that people use to access to news and information, right? So yes, they bring a huge, tremendous benefits, I think, to all our lives. I did actually Google, about this building today. So that's my confession. But at the same time, they're an integral part of the information ecosystem now and the way that citizens, expect to access news, right? And so from our perspective, they do have, a responsibility to society to, recognize the disruption that's taking place and to, support, the production of news and journalism. So what we're hoping to achieve, and I see Gerrit wants to jump in, is putting in place a framework that would require big platforms to come to the table. It gives media businesses the right to collectively bargain with them, and the goal would be that they come out of those negotiations with voluntary agreements in place, so the government doesn't have to get involved. And in the Canadian context, where we've built on the Australian model, is putting down markers about what we see as being in the public interest, right? So that's signing agreements with a diversity of business models. Canada has a highly...
If you continue talking, I forget your first point.
Okay. Okay, I'll wrap up. Consolidated business, right? So we want them to not only sign, agreements with the big businesses, but also the little guys. the regional markets, the different language communities, the indigenous communities, and local outlets. And I'll stop and give you a chance to.
Yeah, so we are you talk about ecosystem, and definitely we see Google as part of the news ecosystem worldwide, and we play an active role there. We provide tools, training, services, be it the data that we deliver to publishers to optimize their content, be it trainings for newsrooms, or be it, in particular here for news professionals, also training programs how to find business models and how to find paying subscribers. Then in Europe, as you talk about the Canadian regulation, in Europe there's also regulation happened last year, European Copyright Directive, and platforms are asked to pay for something that is longer than a snippet. We say in Google we show snippets, so basically we shouldn't pay. Nevertheless, in Germany and in other countries we do negotiate and we do pay for those copyright protected contents, even though they are not clearly defined. So whenever there's a regulation or legislation, we definitely, obviously, negotiate. I find it's slightly pretending the problem is less complex than it is. You say, yeah, there is reach delivered by Google, but unfortunately, we are not paid for that traffic that we deliver, right? So if it's slightly, from our perspective, a little bit unfair that on the one side of the equation, we are forced to a negotiation table. At the other side, what we deliver to publishers is not valued.
But yet, the strength for platforms over single media providers is, of course, that you can adapt and aggregate these different metaphoricized versions of content. I'm not sure if that's a word, but I hope you understand what I mean. In one place, it's much easier for you to do that than, say, DW deciding to start a podcast or a YouTube channel or whatever it is it may be.
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
That it's easier for you to absorb and integrate content when it changes and adapts. Because you were saying that you're not paid for the numbers that you're bringing to other platforms.
So,
outlets, sorry.
I mean, the Deutsche Welle is a good example. They are very active on YouTube with all their different languages, right? They do that free of charge. They reach new audiences. They are able to keep their paying subscribers or their regular subscribers, regular users. So that's a service that we provide for them. And yes, there might be advertising that is then split between YouTube and Deutsche Welle. On search, we are only showing content and then sending the user away, right? So when you talk about absorb content, Google is a go-away site. We don't have interest that a user hangs around there and checks all the links. It's a bad sign if they don't find the link and instantly click on it.
Okay. I'd like to ask oh, all right, there we go. One question at the back, and I believe we have another one here.
Yeah, my name is Tijansi from Senegal. And I think this conversation about Google and the media publishers should also be taken to Africa. I know because African countries are not negotiating as strongly as European countries are doing. Google, because Google is here, but all the tech giants, the GAFA, as we call them, are using African content without any sort of compensation. And unfortunately, because of the, the way the world is going and the power or the lack of power of African nations, there's no even slightest consideration of the interests of African media publishers. And yet, our content is used in the same way the content of other nations are used. I think that is something very, very unfair, regardless of what the Google representative says. It would be interesting I can't keep the floor that much, but it would be interesting to really have a serious conversation about that. And I'm also speaking on behalf of other nations of the Global South. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that was more a statement than a question.
I could add one thing. We launched a training, the Digital Growth Program we launched in South Africa in May. So that's a program for publishers work on their business models, and we're hoping to expand that also to other African countries. But indeed, it's a step-by-step process for us.
We have the gentleman in the glasses. You had raised your hand earlier.
Hello, I have 2 points. The first point, when you said Google want to push away the users to other websites. I don't agree with that. Google is scripting the content from different websites, from travel websites, from blogs, and they currently, like I will give you the example of Google Flights. Right now, a lot of websites that the whole business model is based on the flights. Google will create their own version of that. The second question is, the first one wasn't a question, but just that's the reality. The second question is, we see that on the news or YouTube videos, the CPM or the value of the content is way lower in African countries because the business model is based on ads, and ads in a lot of African countries doesn't provide money for Google. So we can see that Google will lose their interest in that type of content. They don't put the same programs, they don't put the same interest. I'm a content creator, and I create videos on YouTube, and the income from YouTube doesn't push you to create videos on YouTube. A lot of YouTubers in North Africa, they will start on YouTube. A lot of publishers, they will create content for in Arabic, let's say, but then they will not find enough income. So I hope, why don't Google support these creators and doesn't put their whole business model on money, but also on content and push that content to flourish, let's say.
Yep.
So I'll only answer in the interest of time to the second question. Google Flight Search is not what I call search engine. So Google's business model is a platform that connects content to someone willing to pay for it. Be it on YouTube via the monetization of video, or on search for subscriptions or for ads. And in both cases, if we're basically only funneling supply and demand there. So if the demand for advertising is there, then also the creators are paid. If not, or if it is reduced, then also the money both the creator and the platform make are reduced as well. Nevertheless, I think our interests are aligned here. So we are interested in that quality content on search or on YouTube is shown and viewed, and also someone is paying for something. Definitely there are areas that would deserve more attractiveness of advertisers, but unfortunately that's not in the hand of a platform that is in this intermediary status.
By the way, I'd like to pose a question to Njoki, because what we're seeing is a lot of journalists as individuals moving away from even major stations and outlets, or even posting on Google and creating their own platforms. We've seen something like Substack, the emergence of these paid newsletter platforms. So I'd like to know from you, Njoki, do you think that consumer revenue is a viable alternative for income for journalists?
Yeah, so here's the thing. It appears that reader revenue is working very well for media organizations in the West, but in Kenya, it is still yet to take root. I'll give you an example of one of the largest news media organizations in East Africa, East and Central Africa, and that is Nation Media Group that publishes their financials. When you look at their financials, you see that advertising revenue still contributes about 70% of their total revenue. They recently launched their Nation Africa paywall subscription model. And out of the 61,000 people that have registered, only 21,000 are paying. And these are people who are paying on a daily basis, let's say maybe $10 a month or $70 a year. So that is barely enough to move the needle. It's barely enough to pay salaries. So the reality on the ground in East Africa is that advertising, traditional advertising, specifically print advertising, is still king. It still makes up to maybe 70, sometimes 80%, and the same is true for television. But that does not mean that there's no hope for the individual journalists who leave these legacy media organizations to go and start their own outfits. A lot of them have become very successful. Some of them leave the newsroom for various reasons, some out of protest. They're tired of the self-censorship in the media, and they go out and decide to do their own thing. Now, these individual journalists are surviving on grants. A lot of them are surviving on grants, on partnership content partnerships. They're surviving on native advertising. They're providing services like videography, photography, just to pay the bills. So while we talk about reader revenue in the West, and while it's been introduced in Africa, I think it's gonna be maybe 3, 4, 5 years before reader revenue actually moves the needle. But that also means that there's an opportunity, particularly for these smaller news outlets owned by individual journalists, to convince their audiences that their news is worth paying for. Thank you.
Okay, Owen, a question for you, because Njoki brought up the question of grants. We're also seeing a lot of philanthropists coming in to fund news organizations or outfits. Is there a risk that they will one day take over the editorial line?
So maybe just before I get to your question, I would say, it's not just in Africa where news businesses aren't doing well. I mean, that's the Canadian reality as well. Just to give you context, over the last 10 years, news businesses have lost about half of their revenue. We've had 450 closures. On the counter side, we have had the emergence of 100 new outlets who get to start with a fresh page. But the challenge is, so while I agree with my colleague that the distribution costs are lower, it's still like what I get most worried about is we have hundreds of communities in Canada where you don't have someone covering the courthouse or the town hall or city hall, right? News organizations still have fixed costs when it comes to employing journalists, training them, and as we talked about earlier today, increasingly, taking care of their mental health and keeping them safe, right? And so there's still a big gap there, I guess, from where I sit. To your question, Nikki, I think, it's something we worry about a lot, is how do you design government interventions in a way that you keep that healthy distance?
Is it possible?
No, I don't think it's impossible. I think, to give you some context in the Canadian example, Canadian example. So we've instituted a salary tax credit where news organizations get a portion of their salary spent back on eligible expenses. That's done by our income tax agency, right? We do have programs at the Culture Ministry to support the employment of journalists in underserved areas. The way we do that is we work with third partners, so community radio associations, community television associations, press associations, and they work to deliver that funding on our behalf. So we're working really hard to put in place those mechanisms because we do understand that at the end of the day, the trust of institutions, both government and media, are on the line. I do think we also increasingly need to talk about independence from, tech, and that's something we're also thinking about as Canada rolls out the legislative framework that I mentioned earlier, because some of these financial relationships are, I suspect, way bigger than your traditional, even your biggest advertising client might have been, right? And so again, I think we need to be mindful of the financial relationships that are being put in place.
Okay, we've got just time for one more question, and I know you've had your hand up, so I'll give you an opportunity to do so. Please make it brief in the interest of time.
Sure. So I'm just wondering, what's the role of more and better access to the data in this conversation about public interest media viability?
Sorry,
So-
please repeat that from the top.
Okay, so what's the role of more and better access to the data for outlets, for journalists in this discussion of public interest media viability, and what are the obstacles holding that back?
So one word that is in these forums not very popular is that of a product. And if you look at news content as a product, you're very happy to have all the data at your hand and to find out who reads your content, at what time, what does they do with it, what's their willingness to pay, how is it shared, etc. So I'm 100% convinced that if we, over the next years, take a more product-focused view on news content and use the abilities of technology and also of data that we have at our hand, I think we'll make progress. I know it is difficult, definitely, and we are still in this awkward transition phase that I mentioned at the beginning. But for example, the availability of data is next to the reduced cost of production. I think one of the main reasons why there's reason to be optimistic that news content can be consumed and paid for and be successful.
All right, now at the beginning of this conversation, I asked the audience members how many of you are paying for some form of news subscription. Now, after this conversation, I'd like to know how many of you are not subscribed but will maybe consider doing so. We have not changed any hearts or minds. Two, I say that's success. Well, Dr. Njoki Chege joining us from Nairobi, Gerrit Rabenstein, and Owen Ripley, thank you very much for your thoughts and contribution. Round of applause for them.
Thank you.
All right, and ladies and gentlemen, that's it from me right now on day one of the Global Media Forum. However, the program still continues with my colleague Jared Reed, who will be taking us through the Freedom of Speech Award. I please ask you to stay so that we can honor the people who are being awarded. Thank you for your time.